There is an outburst of populist energy across the Western world. Insurgent firebrands like Donald Trump, Nigel Farage and Marine Le Pen are revolting against what they condemn, quite rightly in my view, as a corrupt political class. They call on the people to vote true democracy back into being. The problem, of course, is that our ruling elite is so much broader than a set of elected representatives who agree to play a political version of musical chairs every 4 or 5 years. There is also the academy, the entertainment sphere, and the opinion-forming media, to say nothing of a donor class that pumps money into all three. Part of the genius of this oligarchic regime, what my guest today, the political scientist Curtis Yarvin, calls the cathedral, to symbolize how its various different features add up to a synoptic unity, is that power is dispersed in such a way that the system is very difficult to fight. Is democratic populism up to that task, or is there a subtler, more effective alternative? Curtis Yarvin, thank you very much indeed for joining me today on The Forge.
Thank you so much, Harrison.
Welcome to England as well, I should probably say.
Yes.
In the absence of an elite that shares the fundamental values and interests of its people, is it fair to say that even in an advanced democracy, a supposed democracy, the people are inevitably going to wind up being overpowered and remolded by an elite that does not share their fundamental values and interests?
Well, I think, one of the things that is kind of the bedrock assumptions of democracy, so-called, is that people naturally unite and form political units to defend their interests. And this tendency to naturally unite and defend your collective interests is what Aristotle called philia, as a requirement for a body of citizens, and it's what Ibn Khaldun called asabiya, the sort of collective of will. And I think it's generally true that any population without asabiya is essentially due to be subjugated. And so the condition of sort of leaderlessness, of eliteness, when the Romans subjugated, some Gaulish tribe or whatever, they usually considered it, basically trivial to subjugate the tribe once it had been deprived of its leaders. And so actually it's even a little bit worse than that, because, whether you have leaders capable of leading a community is not the only question. The community itself also has to be capable of following. And that is a skill that is almost entirely lost in our present society.
The thing is, Vercingetorix did not take the side of the Romans. This is the odd thing about our elite, is that they're uniquely oikophobic, and they are the very idea of philia among the people over whom they rule is completely alien to them.
Well, oikophobia is not new. Aristotle describes it as one of the characteristics of tyrants, is that the tyrant relies on essentially an immigrant, Praetorian guard almost. He doesn't use the word immigrant. What does he say?
Probably some foreigner, Xenos or something like
something
that.
Greek and racist, no doubt. And so you see there, yes, in a normal, healthy society, like the ruling class and the ruler and the state is not pitted against the commons, and is also not pitted against the aristocracy. Mm-hmm. And one of the things we see, which is sort of a cautionary tale, for example, for aficionados of monarchy in general, is we see there's another pathology that needs to be recognized at the same time, which is a pathology that we see, for example, in Russia today, that Russia has struggled with really for about the last 150 years, which is the conflict between the state and the intelligentsia. And that conflict is so dire in Russia that even once the intelligentsia got hold of the state, they turned into a new bureaucracy that repelled, the sensitive, bookish young men who had, taken power and slaughtered millions, right? And so that ideal of a state in which the state and the commons and aristocracy are all on the same page and working sort of toward a common commonwealth, if you will, is, I'm afraid, a distant memory in our society.
Yes. Okay. So just talking about our elite, then, I would class them, and maybe oikophobia has longer roots than I'm giving it credit for. But we certainly have an elite in Britain, and you do in the United States, which prioritizes the interests of sort of foreign tribal interest groups over the host populations?
Well, I think that is a means rather than an end. I don't think that actually these people have any particular love for their client group. And one of the simplest ways that you see that is that if you look at the history of leftism in the UK and Great Britain over the last 150 years, you see this continual recycling of client groups. They dump the last group. It's like a cad who goes through girlfriends. Relationship ended with the coal miners. Now dating the Somalis, and what is the Facebook terminology there?
It's complicated, maybe?
It's complicated, yes, exactly. It's complicated, And so you have these strange anachronisms like, calling this party like a labor party when it really should be called the slave labor party, or the Deliveroo party, perhaps. And because you speak of the Deliveroo class, right?
Yes, we do.
And, meanwhile, native Britons have almost entirely lost the ability to work and have, degenerated into this horrific social housing chav class, and it's entirely useless people. And it's sort of shocking. Theodore Dalrymple, Anthony Daniels, who you must know or know of, a wonderful writer, wrote this book about 20 years ago called Life at the Bottom, which struck a chord in many Americans because it was describing, as Jerry Taylor would say, a white underclass. and this white underclass, this white underclass has, many of the same characteristics and is created by many of the same sociological principles accepted at all major universities today, by the way, that have created actually a black underclass. It turns out that you can, if you work hard enough, I forget who said, the whites are becoming black, but you can really debase. It would be interesting to try this on Jews to see if you could debase Jews by these methods. I think you probably could. Or Japanese, Japanese on welfare would be an amazing reality show.
Yes, let me get to so we're talking here about the respective roles of elites and people in human societies, and clearly we have an oikophobic elite at the moment, whether they're driven by self-interest, as you argue, or whether they're driven by
It's not even self-interest, because the thing is that actually you'll see these classes be actually quite selfless. They'll be selfless even in bizarre and horrifying ways. They will subject themselves to various depredations very cheerfully and in a very strange way. And you'll constantly see them making excuses. For example, in San Francisco, what's it called? There's a street near, God, I forget. Breaking into cars is quite a thing. Bipping.
Yes.
You smash the window, you whatever, right? And you'll see these people falling over backward, basically for apologizing the fact that they've had to replace their windows 20 times, right? And 20 times, 10 times, 5 times, right? And so it's not even in their own self-interest. That's like saying a crack addict is smoking crack at his own interest. It's what he wants, but it's not in his interest. And so actually it's not just that the rest of society needs to be saved from these people. They actually need to be saved from themselves.
The question is then, that sooner or later, so obviously you accord a greater role to elites in the formation of political movements than you do to disorganized masses.
Yeah.
But the question arises, the luxury belief class sooner or later is going to run into human nature. When Plato says that he thinks in his ideal republic that there's no reason why parents should care more for their own children than they care for the children of strangers, that's not going to be workable in a society because it so violates natural human impulses. And the people's patience is wearing thin in advanced Western democracies at the moment.
This whole idea that the people's patience is wearing thin, is this. It's doer optimism. Frankly, it's a crock, and I stand very strongly against it. You may recall the internet meme of the Kipling poem When the Saxon Began to Hate.
Yes.
And it's accompanied by the meme of like a skeleton on the bench. He's been waiting for about 100 years for the Saxon to begin to hate. And I think I think if you take sort of a long view, I would assert, and maybe it's a strong assertion, but I would assert that the power of democracy, very strictly defined in England, has been declining for about 500 years. And the reason I say this is that democracy as a formal system, democracy is a force. It's the power of the many. It's the power of the mob. And when we look at basically the power of the mob, of the London mob, being here in London, 500 years ago, you would see basically that, what democracy meant in the Tudor era, what the power of the mob went was, for example, a rumor might go around London that the German merchants in the steel yard are undercutting true-born Englishmen in the wool trade. And there's a very simple solution to this problem, which is that for all the London apprentices to get together and kill as many Germans as they could find, which was naturally not very pleasing to the king who taxed these things. But the king had no standing army. What's he going to do? Right. And so, Mary Tudor, marries Philip II, the defender of the Catholic faith, and, she, of course, herself was a Catholic. She likes to burn people. What she really wants is to restore the true faith to England. And she'd love to do it on the backs of Spanish bayonets, but she can't even start to do it because she has no standing army, and she's terrified of being torn to shreds by the mob. This is the problem with being an island. You think you don't need a standing army until you realize that you actually need it to, maintain unified government. And as someone reminded me of my reading of the memoirs or the testament of Louis XIV, where he says nothing is so conducive to good government as the unity within a single person. And as soon as that unity is broken, you get basically sort of imperium and imperio is the old Roman phrase. You get conflicting incentives. And when you give the parts power over the whole, the parts have incentives that do not correlate with the interests of the whole. And so when you look at basically, you're saying the people are losing their patience, let's go from, these kinds of riots in London 500 years ago to the recent and, extremely regrettable anti-Cambrian riots that we had the other day. I've been talking extensively about, the danger of anti-Cambrian hate because the thing is that I have to say that just because 3 children were stabbed by a Welshman, does not, from Cardiff, I believe,
yes.
does not, that the idea that this reflects on all Welshmen as a whole is absurd and frankly repellent and offensive. And I stand with Cambria on this. And
they've suffered enough. And
the thing is, England has always been a nation of migrants, always been a nation of foreigners. And, look no further than the fact that, the heir to the throne is, of course, the Prince of Wales. Wales, very important part of the Cambria in Latin, of course, very important part of the glorious United Kingdom. And what does the word Welsh mean in Saxon? Do you know the answer to this?
I don't.
It means foreigner. It means literally, I think it's like someone who can't speak, basically. Yeah. And so, English, the Welsh were in some ways, the oldest remnants of this land because they were, I say they were driven out, of course. It's really their own fault. It was a Welsh flight. After the Saxon migrations, they were xenophobic. And so they left, yes. And basically denied the invading Saxons the benefit of their Roman culture. Which is only the first of the crimes of the Cambrians. Of course, we forgive them. Yeah, that's very important. There's no anti-Cambrianism here. But yeah, it's like, obviously a very serious problem of anti-Cambrianism.
So to go back to the issue, clearly, I would agree with you that the people are either too busy doing other things or don't have the inclination.
They're just too weak. And the thing is, overall, you can, investigate or ask the question of why they are too weak. I think the best, question, obviously we don't want the English to be strong enough to have anti-Welsh pogroms, as once they would easily have done so. But be that as it may, I mean, I'm not a believer in democracy. That's why I'm, stating so negatively my view of mob violence and mob power. But if you just look objectively and think of mobs and democracy as neither good nor bad and just analyze sort of the power it has, I think a better example than these very, very bad violent riots, people waving flags and that sort of thing, just not not acceptable in the 21st century, but, is the Gilets jaunes in France, which you might remember from right before COVID. So the Gilets jaunes who were, rallying to defend, they were very oikophilic. They wanted to defend, France and French culture and, things like that, right? And just backward stuff, frankly. And they had this idea, I don't know where they came up with it, that you could basically take a bunch of civilians and dress them in identical clothing, and that would feel very powerful. I don't know where they had the idea of all wearing the same color of vest, but it seems like if you really want to supercharge democracy, as in mob power, it's a very, very good thing for the same reason that soldiers wear uniforms, of course. And so the organizers, I think they were barely organized, as befits a democratic force. The organizers or the leaders of the Gilets jaunes are the participants in the Gilets jaunes. Basically, they were French. They'd gone to school in French. They'd read a lot of elementary school French textbooks, enough. I mean, these are not obviously very literate people, but they read enough to know that if you are disappointed, if you're French, and if you're a person of French, and you're disappointed with your government, the way that you change that is you get a lot of Frenchmen, of French persons together in the street, and then there will be change. So it's like sort of the underpants gnomes thing, where 1, get a lot of freshmen together, 2, ? 3, power, right? And so they did the one thing, and they stormed the Bastille, as it were. But they just got a bunch of people in the streets and waited for something to happen. Sort of like, the old cargo cult thing, you wave the orange paddles and the cargo lands, but it's not going to land because the war is over. So you probably made the paddles wrong or something. And nothing happened. Why did nothing happen? What's wrong with our school books? This was supposed to work. And so they promptly, and this was really very funny, especially to a cynical observer of the present such as me, they decided that this was only Act 1. And Act 2 next weekend, they would do it, and this time it would work. And I think they got up to something like Act 54, very long play, and then COVID happened, and it was all a bust, right? And, when you do that kind of cargo cult democracy, as if the people's patience is wearing thin, I'm just like, no, the people have a serious case of what in psychology is called learned helplessness. If you drag people into the street in their freaking yellow traffic vest 54 times and it doesn't work, you can be pretty sure that you would never drag them into the street, for any purpose whatsoever, because they would really feel in their bones the completely ineffectual nature of resistance. So, and if you looked at that crowd of 300,000 Frenchmen and you looked at them individually, I would say probably about 10% of them maybe had ever been in a fist fight. If you're looking for any of them who would have killed a man, probably less than 10 people in the crowd had ever killed anyone, especially on purpose. And you're expecting this mob to storm the Bastille. Do you know what happened in the storming of the Bastille? They're just we're going to rip you limb from limb and eat your organs, because that is what pre-modern, pre-domesticated people do. And you're looking at these incredibly domesticated people today who are incredibly easy to rule. And therefore, the idea that incompetent government of whatever level is going to make the people lose their patience. I mean, I saw this astounding, statistic recently in America, Gallup poll. 40% of Americans do not feel safe walking at night outside their own homes. I mean, and if you believe that you have the best system of government on earth for all time, and you have that statistic, I don't even know what to tell you. You're not living in reality. And so, the idea of, it's like, imagine if you were in, say, the late Roman Empire. So in the Roman Republic, of course, in the late Roman Republic, especially mob violence, street violence is very, very important. But nobody in the age of, Domitian is wow, Domitian has really lost the patience of the people, right? It's just not even fucking relevant. The people have ceased to be a relevant force. And this is also why not just direct, unorganized, violent democracy has stopped working. This is also why representative democracy has stopped working, because because the people have the politicians, could coerce the government when they had the threat of their supporters behind them. But actually, when their supporters are not a threat, nobody gives a rat's ass. Right. And so this is why politicians have basically gone down the same path of becoming purely symbolic that the kings and queens had followed long before.
So democracy, the rule of the many, whatever the people's current state of patience or learned helplessness is ruled out. And you're in very good company, historically speaking, when it comes to adopting that perspective. It's quite,
I take the word democracy literally, basically.
Yes, as in, yes. Yeah. And you're in good company. And I was going to mention Bolingbroke's idea of a patriot king. Of a patriot king. Patriot king. We're in England. We're in England. He envisions, as you know, but for viewers who don't, he envisions a sort of paternalistic monarchy that can be not democratic in terms of its processes, but democratic in terms of its spirit.
That can command democratic support. And the thing is,
crucially against the Whig oligarchy of the mid 18th century.
That's right. That's right. And so the alliance of absolute ruler and people against an oligarchy, comes into our debased 20th century as basically, that's literally a description of fascism. Bolingbroke has essentially invented, fascism in the early 18th century, right? And because that alignment of essentially, again, the leader with the people against the aristocracy, definition of fascism.
In the 20th century, it is, yes. But of course, which is why you need to point to these precursors in order to calm people down.
You get the bad taste out of people's mouths,
Yes.
And
the crucial question, Curtis, is why does it need to be one man? Why can't it be a dedicated counter-elite? And this isn't just idealistic. I would actually point to the 18th century as an example of this happening. I mean, George III did not become Bolingbroke's idea of a patriot king. He didn't develop more powers in the late 18th century than he had when he inherited those powers. In 1760, he didn't. What happened is that a dedicated counter-elite, led by sort of Pittite, national conservative types,
King's Friends,
supplanted the Whig oligarchy.
So, but you couldn't really have the King's Friends without the king, now could you really? And if you basically look at furthermore, to say that they supplanted the Whig oligarchy is rather incorrect. They challenged the Whig oligarchy, and the Whig oligarchy, in a way, retaliated by supporting the Americans in the Revolutionary War.
I'm talking about after 1789. So I'm talking about when George dissolves Parliament in 1783, installs William Pitt the Younger as Prime Minister, vindicated at the subsequent 1784 election. And thereafter, people like Charles James Fox, who were very significant and important figures in the 1770s, by the late 1780s and 1790s were completely marginal, and the priorities were different. They were addressing the French Revolution, and complaints about popery began to ring very hollow in that new environment. And you have a sort of patriotic, Pittite government.
Yeah, okay, this is a period that you clearly know better than me. And then, of course, you have kind of former Whigs who've become Tories like Burke, and Pitt. And I often describe Burke just to piss American conservatives off. I often describe him as the Jane Fonda of the American Revolution, and because he does everything but come to America and climb half naked over a congressional howitzer, and. The trip was a little more difficult at that time.
He was, yes.
But if he could have, he would have, and he wouldn't have looked as good as Jane Fonda, though, I'm afraid, but you have periods of conservative ascendancy, but, these periods of sort of reaction, if you will, tend to be supplanted. I mean, yes, are there right-wing successes in history, but also, certainly, Pitt is not about to restore the Stuarts. In fact, I think by that time they feel so non-threatened by the Stuarts that the Stuart pretenders granted a pension. It's not 1745 anymore. And, speaking of the 45, there's a wonderful, wonderful book that's worth reading. It really cast light on the American Revolution for me by a fellow by the Scottish nobleman by the name of the Chevalier Johnstone. And Johnstone he was an officer in Bonnie Prince Charlie's army, and the whole, it's like you have this rhetoric of, in the American Revolution of if we're all if you're not hanging together, we will hang separately. And I'm like, if you could somehow teleport George Washington to London in like 1779, he would be treated much as if you could teleport Ho Chi Minh to Berkeley in 1969. He would not be hanged. He would have a party to go to every night, And most Americans, A, do not realize this, and B, do not realize the implications of this. And the implication of this is that essentially the American Revolution, from a military stance, is always an extremely half-hearted and poorly supported war.
On the British side.
On the British side. And on the British side. And, that is really put into very stark relief by the 45, because the 45, rather than being a leftist revolt,
we should say that when you say the 45, you mean the 1745 attempt to supplant the Hanoverian dynasty by the Stuarts.
That's right.
Yes,
that's right. And remarkable, romantic, Bonnie Prince Charlie, lands with a few men in a boat, like, Fidel Castro in the Granma, goes up into the hills, recruits the clans, unites the clans, takes Edinburgh, although not Edinburgh Castle, takes Edinburgh. And, some people are like, okay, you're the King of Scotland. You could stop there. I don't know if that was a good idea. But then he's like, no, I'm going for the whole schmear. I'm going to go down to London, and brings his army of like wild Highland clansmen who are just like, it's, I think, the last battle in history in which the two-handed sword the claymore plays a serious role. These Highlanders are fierce, and reloading a musket takes some time.
It's also, just for trivia, it's also the last battle in which a king actually fought. I think George II was involved.
Oh, interesting. I thought it was the Duke of Cumberland who did most of the...
Yes, but he showed up. He wasn't just swanning around in Buckingham House.
Got it. Yes, and they have many surprising, lucky successes. It's very romantic, and then they get defeated at Culloden, and the result of that is that these rebels are basically... the second half of the Johnstone's memoir is essentially him trying to escape from Scotland like a Jew trying to get out of Nazi Germany. Because basically the principle that is applied to these rebels, number one, if you were a rebel and anything but a private soldier, you had to die. Number two, if you were a rebel officer and you surrendered and were given your word of pardon, too bad, fuck you, the deal has changed, you gotta die, right? And number three, if you were a traditional indigenous community, such as the Highlanders, would you describe those as indigenous peoples? It's a good question, right? And that means your whole society needs to be destroyed, you need to be civilized, you need to be shipped to the West Indies, etc., etc., etc. Total ruthless ethnic cleansing of the Highlands. Right, and if you imagine the treatment, and obviously in the 1770s, there are many people who remember the 1740s, which are as distant as World War II in the 1970s, and there are many Americans, especially many of the loyalist persuasion, who are just like, I'm going to side with loyalists because it's obvious that, Britain has the power to win here. And then is just completely, like a Vietnam War hawk, is just completely baffled and frustrated by these continual failures to win, General Howe abandoning Boston with barrels of gunpowder on the, and there's always this sort of suspicion that maybe Howe doesn't really want to win the war. And in fact, I think those suspicions are quite justified because Howe is a Whig general and he is sent with a dual mission. It's very similar to Vietnam because the strategy of Howe is to coerce the rebels into making peace. He does not want to come home with his own domestic ambitions and be like, yeah, sorry, nothing to be done with them. Boston is a smoking ruin. These rebels had to root them out. Goddamn Puritans, we couldn't deal with them in the 17th century, but now we finally settled their hash, and the last of them are being scalped by Indians as we speak, right? And that was not what would please his constituency. His constituency definitely wanted the unity of the First British Empire, just like Lyndon Johnson wanted to win the war in Vietnam. He did, but he didn't want to win it by making North Vietnam the 51st state, right? Or giving it to the French or anything reasonable like that, right? He wanted to win it by coercing them to make peace, and he was all into the game theory of that. and they didn't know shit from game theory in the 18th century. But the Americans adopted much the same strategy as Ho Chi Minh, which was that each one of these sort of craven peace offers was just rejected unceremoniously. And the more the British tried to compromise, the more the Americans were just like, no. The British would try to compromise, and, the Americans would be like, oh, I'm going to double down. Actually, I'm twice that. Like, your attempt to compromise is offensive to me. And so it's somewhat ironic that the received history of that war has become this ridiculous Whig history that the Americans were driven away by inadequate, compromise or whatever. And it's absolutely absurd. And, it's like saying that America lost the Vietnam War because it was too harsh, or something, right? It's unbelievable. There's no military reality to it. This is done by taking the colonists essentially at face value. And if you take the colonists at face value, there's a recent absolutely terrible history book called The Royalist Revolution or something like that, which takes all the times that basically, American pettifogging, because America had at the time inherited this horrible trait of everybody being a country lawyer there was a very Puritan thing, and they're always doing these pettifogging things with the law. And so when the Parliament said something that they didn't like, they're like, we answer only to the king. And then the king would say something they didn't like, and they're like, oh no, we're responsible to Parliament, and they always denied that they had any interest in independence whatsoever. Which is just a complete inversion of reality. In fact, the American colonies since 1688 had essentially de facto independence. And there's a very interesting pamphlet by Daniel Defoe called Shortest Way with the Dissenters. Do you know the story of Shortest Way with the Dissenters?
I actually don't.
Oh, it's amazing. So it's so worth I couldn't believe it when I discovered this. So Defoe, of course, is a Whig. He's a dissenter. And he publishes, and this is the thing, he's sent to the pillory. This is the pamphlet he sent to the pillory for. The reason he's sent to the pillory is he publishes this, it's as if someone were to publish a pamphlet, an anonymous pamphlet, but, maybe sounding like it's in the voice of Michael Anton, that would call for, deporting all the blacks and Democrats to Canada. Right, and this was actually presented as the policy of J.D. Vance, right? And essentially, Queen Anne, who has her Tory sympathies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, she's certainly somewhat centrist, right? Really regrets, does not approve of this kind of false pride. This is really this is not satire. This was intended to be read as something that, it's like the people who think of Project 2025 as, this plan to, do what actually needs doing, right? And it's just not, right? And so what's interesting is that although Defoe is sent to the pillory for this, and although the expressions in Shortest Way with the Dissenters are far more radically right-wing than any Tory at the time possibly would have uttered, it also makes very interesting statements that history has vindicated. And so, for example, one of the things it says about America is, it says that it's a little coy, and it says, I'm not saying we need to burn the Puritans like Queen Mary, but they've been suffered to go away after causing the English Civil War. They were suffered to go away to America and become de facto independent, and this is being written in 1706. And so actually what happens is the same crop of new nationalist administrators, kind of, Colbertians in a way, inspired by the French, physiocratic tradition to some extent, are like, let's, wow, this is really weird. We have this colony that's just totally been mismanaged, and it's just full of smuggling and, acting as if it's independent, but legally we have the right to actually rule these colonies in an appropriate and effective way, and therefore we should do so, and let's crack down on the smuggling and all of this stuff. And, by that time, of course, the colonies really did consider themselves pretty much independent because, the last attempt to actually rule North America was Andros and the Dominion of New England as established by James II. And Andros basically combines New York and the whole upper Atlantic into one thing, which is, New York is not he's like the whore of Babylon to the Bostonians. So they didn't.
It was quite royalist.
Yeah. It was quite. It was the royalist center during the Revolution, right? And and Andros. So Andros is sort of one of these James II people that want to bring some French methods into, England. And as soon as they hear of the Glorious Revolution in Boston, they actually perform, I would say, what was perhaps history's first color revolution. They simply the Bostonians just spontaneously rise up, arrest Governor Andros, and restore their theocratic republic that they, had established, long before. And
so bringing it back to today, I think what all of this does show to some extent, a lot of the struggles of the 17th century and the 18th century, is that it is possible for elite struggles to have significant consequences quite apart from any kind of Bolenbrechian solution. For example, why do you not go along with someone like Christopher Rufo, who would point to the potential that a counter-elite might have, as opposed to your model of just for viewers who don't know, as opposed to your model of a sort of neo-monarch? Why does it need to be one man? Why can't it be a dedicated minority?
History never, I think, has seen a case where one oligarchy replaces another. I don't think it's possible. I can't imagine how it would work. And when people expect it to work, they're generally LARPing. So there's a young man named Saurabh Sharma of the, I believe he's of, what was he?
American Moment.
Yeah, American Moment. I believe he's what they call here an Asian. And the American Moment, which is very much dedicated to this idea, and it's dedicated to in its vision of basically the success of this counter-elite is that good, God-fearing, meat-grilling Americans elect, a president such as Donald Trump. And he appoints all these bright young men to positions of power, as he fondly imagines, in the U.S. government. Now, one of the ways that the actual U.S. government differs from, the difference between the American and British administrative state is that the British administrative state, the yes minister state, so-called,
or no minister.
You have basically permanent bureaucrats going pretty much all the way to the top. And so you have these ministers who come in and basically have no sort of support staff loyal to them exclusively in any way. And they simply rely on the professionalism of, what's his name? Sir Humphrey Appleby. Right. And so in the American system, it's a little bit different, which is that there's something called the Plum Book, which is a list of what are called Schedule Cs. There's about 5,000 people that the president gets to appoint. And no doubt, Mr. Sharma is obviously thinking of, wow, we'd better train these people so that rather than appointing lobbyists and hacks, as a Republican president often does, we could appoint a disciplined cadre of these, a counter-elite, if you will, of these activists to really take over the government and make it work. This requires a level of detachment from reality that I find profoundly irresponsible. Because if you have I sort of grew up in the American deep state. My dad was in the State Department. If you have any idea how these systems work, you're going to parachute these people in. Okay, you're going to parachute these people into the deep state. They will be sort of like parachuting into France in 1942. They are instantly surrounded by their enemies, who they can do nothing to. It's like parachuting into France in 1942, but it's sort of like parachuting into France, in 1942 with super soakers.
It's not D-Day.
Yeah, you're basically have these, these commandos trained by Saurabh Sharma and his secret, salmon reserve in Scotland or whatever, and you give them parachutes and super soakers, and it's not even Dieppe, because in Dieppe they actually had guns.
Yes.
They had actual guns, but here they have super soakers.
Yes.
And they come in and they're temporary guests in a machine in which they have absolutely no way of coercing the people who supposedly work for them in this entirely fictitious pyramid-shaped org chart, which is, and the fiction extends up to when Americans vote for president, they really think they're electing a king. That's really, and they use the language that suggests that they believe this.
What are you going to do on your first day, Mr. President?
Yeah, exactly. I don't know, some photo ops. Like imagine a situation in which the president is really the CEO of the executive branch, like it says in the motherfucking bloody Constitution, and spends a third of his time, half of his time on photo ops. It's unreal, and you're being drowned in ceremony in just the way the kind of fake kings of England were drowned in ceremony. And the ceremony actually has an effective purpose, which is sort of the same as the purpose of the Hanoverian kings, which is to prevent there being an actual king, right? And so, and if you're one of these Schedule Cs that Mr. Sharma has trained up in his secret party indoctrination centers or whatever he's doing out there, covered with camouflage netting so drones can't see it, and they're learning to shoot super soakers, right? And you come into one of these jobs, and basically the people who nominally work for you, but who will in fact be determining your fate, are basically like, not in so many words, you have a choice. Okay, either you can betray the president who appointed you and you can be with us. You can be a team player. You can play ball. We'll make you look good. We might even be able to make you a hero in the press. And if you work really hard and keep your nose clean like a good boy, you might even be able to do what we call burrowing in, which is actually to transition from a political appointee into the permanent civil service. And you could actually get a career out of it. On the other hand, if you want to fuck with us, you might not be aware that this agency of the executive branch, like every other agency of the executive branch, is actually not an executive agency at all. It is an administrative agency, and that means that its functioning is set by the Congress and the Supreme Court. It is in fact a matter of law. Have you heard of the law? Do you believe in the rule of law? And the thing is, what you're going to find is that if you obey the whims of this president in the White House's political directives, his executive orders, which have approximately the legal meaning of a tweet, then you're going to find that you're breaking the law. And you know what we do? We believe very strongly, as here in England, as we see with these latest prosecutions for this brutal anti-Cambrian hate that we were seeing, like America is a law-abiding country. You can't do a hate speech, here in Britain. You can't hate on the Welsh like that, and it's simply not allowed. And we also have a lot of laws in America. And, what you notice is, the level of lawfare that was applied to, like, Donald Trump and his people in his first term is like a little baby step compared to what's going to be done to these people now, because everyone has realized that it works. And it's not just that it works and it gets its target. Oh no, it works in that anyone who's doing it becomes a national hero. His name is in the paper constantly. He gets book deals, right? It's, it's everything. And so, for example, a Trumpist might counter with a new proposal of like, okay, we've got Schedule C for political appointees, but here's our new Schedule F, as in Press F. I don't know if that's why they called it that, but Press F. And so we've decided...
Explain what that would do.
It's the unilateral executive order, which makes no sense because it imagines that the president is somehow in charge of the executive branch, which is frankly ridiculous and totally unconstitutional and wrong. It would be like the king saying off with his head. Imagine Charles III being like off with his head, to some journalist or something, right? And absolutely absurd, unthinkable, unconstitutional, and frankly unkingly. And a modern king knows that the true nature of being a king is to be a constitutional king who's a symbol to his people, right? And that's also what a true president is, like President Biden. He's a symbol to his people, and and he looks good on TV, and he can read from a teleprompter. And I guess they started to have problems with the latter part, but so in any case, Schedule F is basically the president unilaterally announcing that he has the right to fire any significant civil servant.
Yes.
Okay. Here's what happens when you try that. First of all, you just decided that that was a thing. There's no law that you passed there. There's no judge that said, you just decided that that was a thing. So here's what happens. Some official does something egregious, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know, some insert egregious lib thing, somewhere. President Trump's coming and goes out and he's like, you're fired. Okay, he tests Schedule F. And this test immediately becomes a test case. It becomes a cause célèbre. The official who's been thus ungratefully fired becomes a national hero. Because, of course, the press can make anyone a national hero. Cue the book deals, cue the whatever. The day you get fired for Schedule F is the best day of your life. It has launched you into being a celebrity. You will be recognized in the street, and your book will sell by the bushel, by the truckload, by the pallet, right? And so essentially, it's like Brer Rabbit, don't throw me in the briar patch, and so the weakness of those, if you look at these methods for basically, first of all, you'll notice that both of these things are still depending on a monarchical unified executive. You're still needing a monarch to try to replace one oligarchy with another. And then rather than making the monarch strong enough to just throw the whole system and replace it, you're like, okay, technically he's super weak, but what if we make him stronger? Well, he's so weak that you could make him 10 times as strong as he was, and he would still be, entirely worthless. And so, other things that have been proposed, for example, for this oligarchical replacement structure is an infiltration strategy as practiced, for example, by our good friends, the communists. And it is true that this was a thing. On the other hand, for communists to infiltrate a civil service made out of liberals doesn't take a whole lot of subterfuge because they're basically the same thing anyway. And, oh my God, I've said it bad, right? And I'm like, am I going to be arrested? Will Harsh Dharma get me? And I'll be out of the country before the podcast is released.
Yeah, you should be.
It's you who's you're very courageous here, man. And so, infiltrating, that's more like saying, okay, Protestants are going to infiltrate the Catholic Church in order to overthrow the Pope. It's like really inherently somewhat science fictional and implausible. It's actually fantastic.
The present oligarchy is not suicidally open-minded.
No, not at all, and nor do the kinds of people who we know who would be relied on to do this are not naturally deceitful, scheming little bastards. All those people belong to the other side. So you've got to use the skills that you have. So that method of oligarchical replacement doesn't work at all. And I don't really know of another one.
Okay.
And so that basically leaves, when as your own Mr. Sherlock Holmes has observed, when you eliminate, the impossible, all that's left is the improbable. And the improbable is so improbable that, both the U.S. and the U.K. have had monarchical leaders within the lives of those now living, like FDR. Right. So actually, moreover, I realize that monarchy seems very outre, or absolute monarchy seems very outre to people living today. But that's simply, a kind of temporal parochialism. That's presentism. Obviously, this is a system of government, under which, most of history functioned. It's a system of government that Gibbon described in The Name of the Five Good Emperors as the best system of government that humanity's ever experienced. Hume is like, the best government is obviously a stable monarchy, right? And so you're sort of rejecting the obvious simple solution for contrived outre solutions whose main method of operation seems to be, okay, we can get people to believe this because we don't have to break their frame that much. We can turn the lie into half a lie, and if we only believe half a lie, this would work. Well, the lie is just a lie.
Let me just say something just for 30 seconds or so. So, one of the problems with the rule of the many we've established doesn't work. The rule of the dissident few is likely to
I want to say,
on board.
let me interrupt you. The rule of the many doesn't work in two senses. Usually people criticize the rule of the many and they say the many are not competent to rule. They're uneducated. They're lagerlouts. They're gammons. How would you put these gammon lagerlouts, in charge of a modern, sophisticated, technocratic country? There's a case for that. But the thing is, there's an even stronger case for the fact that the incompetent can never rule because they will not be competent to hold power.
Yes.
Because there's a certain level of it's just as implausible that, these kinds of people could rule the country as it is that the, citizens of Alexandria in 250 AD could govern Alexandria. They could mob up. We can't even do that.
Yes, but we're up. So one of the things that's different about our time is that we're up against a clock in a very serious way. So, I would argue that demographic replacement, right, migration has already transformed the West in destructive ways.
I think there's been very little migration.
Relative to what could be the case. But let me just
relative to what will be the case.
What will be the case, perhaps. Okay, so my question might have been slightly cut off at the root there.
Sorry.
Well, no, don't worry. In the sense that you sort of answered it. But I suspect that with the demographics of 1984, when Reagan completely trounced Mondale, just with the demographic composition of the United States as it existed then, if it existed now, Trump would completely obliterate Kamala Harris. And so,
California, the state where I live, used to be a Republican one-party state.
Nixon, Reagan, both came out of California.
Sure.
But here's the question then. How you didn't say it was impossible, you said it was improbable. How would your sort of neo-monarchical vision come about, and are you encouraged by the apparent war within the elite that's going on at the moment, particularly between Elon Musk and other tech titans of industry and sclerotic bureaucracies?
Well, so, I would say one of the reasons I disagree with Mr. Sharma's plan is, sorry. Oh man, he's a very cool kid, actually. I really like him. But one of the problems, with the Shawarma plan,
sorry. One of the problems with the dedicated counter-elite...
One of the problems with the dedicated counter-elite plan is that actually it goes directly up against one of the sort of core elements of wisdom of the fellow who actually did this and understood how to do this, who was Napoleon. And Napoleon had the opposite idea. Napoleon's principle was the career open to talents. And what he meant by this, he had this nice line where he's like, any country that is governed by the most talented people, and any government that contains the most talented people is safe, right? And by that standard, no, I don't think Whitehall and DC are very safe.
Yes.
Right. On the other hand, there's pretty safe in a lot of other ways. But what Napoleon found was that when he came to absolute power, politics ceased. And so he could hire anyone, whether they'd been a Jacobin or a royalist or a Lafayetteist, it didn't matter because politics was over. Moreover, the way a bureaucracy, like an administrative state, works is fundamentally not exactly bottom up, but kind of middle out, in that it's ruled by process. It is there's no real org chart in that sense. There is an org chart, but it's essentially in a process-focused organization rather than a command-focused organization. So in a process-focused organization, you have a book of rules that dictates your process. You have a manager, but your manager is not hiring you to accomplish a mission. Your manager is there in case you find something that doesn't fit the rules, and you got to kick it up to the manager. And if it goes all the way up to the top, it goes up to the president, who's used as a sort of decision oracle in a purely reactive way. This has nothing to do with what Elon Musk does all day, right? Elon Musk does not understand this. Basically, the problem with these California libertarian billionaires is that they have no idea how bad the problem is. None, I just this morning saw President Trump has suggested that Elon Musk become the chair of the Department of Government Efficiency, aka Doge, which of course for the more literate people. Actually, some people think of Doge as simply a misspelling of dog, and they remember as Shiba Inu. But, you and I, Harrison, I'm quite confident, think of the most serene Republic of Venice and its leader, the Doge, which is Doge is a cognate for, in English, what language, what word?
Is it the same as Duma in Russian?
No, Duma is a parliament. Yes. But in English,
I don't know.
Duke.
Oh, Duke. Okay, yes.
Doge, Duke. And yes. In Italian, think hard.
I don't. I speak Spanish, not Italian, sadly.
Do you know any history?
Yes, a fair bit.
Duce?
Oh, Duce. Okay, right.
And coming from the Latin dux, of course, dux meaning just a military leader.
Yes.
Right. And so, again, we are confronted with the specter of fascism, right? and so, if you appoint Elon Musk as Doge, so to speak, and he wants to make the government efficient, well, if you wanted to run the government efficiently, you would do actually the California startup thing, which is you would simply replace it with a different organization, which is about approximately 100,000 times easier and more effective than trying to take a process-oriented bureaucracy and turn it into some kind of mission-oriented thing. It would be like, if you told Elon Musk basically that he had to build a space program and start with NASA, he would simply fire all of NASA and build SpaceX. Okay, but coming into Washington, because he's basically doesn't know what he's doing in that context, and he's sort of LARPing in this kind of, Elon Musk is sad to say, he's not a dark enlightenment, whatever. He's just kind of a 90s libertarian. And as a 90s libertarian, he's just like one of many competent people who come into Washington like a complete fish out of water and just like flop around and accomplish nothing. Trump in his first term put Rex Tillerson, the CEO of Exxon, and made him put him at the State Department.
Yes.
The idea, first of all, managing Exxon is not really, it's almost the public sector already. It's very reactive. And the idea that he would somehow make the State Department managed better, he just, is absurd. Like, you actually can't make these organizations more, you can cut a little here or modify it. You could tweak a little, but you can't make them into organizations that are even 1/1000th as efficient as SpaceX. Moreover, if you're doing this kind of organization where you're just like, okay, I'm going to replace the State Department, great, then you're face to face with an even more muddy question of what is the State Department and what does it do and why does it do it? And is this new organization going to have the same goals and missions as the State Department? Because the State Department is, of course, living in this sort of like exquisite historical fantasy, which it itself has constructed of the global American empire. And you're like, is this good? Is it bad? What does it even mean? And you're just like, you would not, if you actually worked from first principles in the way that Elon Musk does when he launches a rocket, you would be like, I don't even know, even the concept of a rocket is up for grabs here. Because if you look at what the State Department does and the system it administrates, it is almost entirely a contingent product of history. And, one of the funniest things about sort of American history and specifically the area of foreign policy is this concept we have, this very Orwellian concept of national security. And the idea of national security basically develops sort of right after the war, if indeed not before or during the war. You might recall there's a line which FDR said to journalists and then later took back and claimed he didn't say, but of course he did say it, where he said America's frontier is on the Rhine. Okay, and this extension of the concept of national security, I think Roosevelt said something more explicit about it at one point. He was like, political events everywhere in the world affect America's national security. So national security means basically ruling the world. Because we have to basically rule Nepal, or at least make sure Nepal is doing only the right things and not the wrong things, to keep, for example, Illinois safe from, some kind of Nepali first nuclear strike or something, right? And, are you saying that Nepal couldn't build a nuclear bomb? That sounds very anti-Nepalese to me, right? There's a lot of great Nepalese physicists that I think, must exist, right? So, then they had this concept of national security, but then there was 9/11. Okay, and then they were sort of faced with a new problem. They had to secure the nation, but that was already covered under national security. So they came up with this new word, of course, which is Homeland Security, which has a weird mid-century ring to it. And are you saying Heimat? Are you saying Heimat? Yeah. Right? And is that what you're saying there? Right. And so, we have this, ridiculous Orwellian thing in which national security actually means ruling the world, right? Or for example, one of the things, of course, we were discussing before the show, we were talking about Hitler and, and his plan to world domination, like, Hitler world dominations, cheese and a cheeseburger, right? So, I've often, fantasized about being able to raise my hand and ask, Hillary Clinton or someone a question. And, of course, Hitler was aiming at world domination. He was going to send panzer divisions into Mexico to cross the Rio Grande. This was going to happen, right? If we hadn't, defeated him first, but Hitler aimed at world domination, but, we in the international community provide global leadership.
What's the difference?
Exactly. Between seizing world domination and providing global leadership, right? Yeah. World domination, global leadership. World domination, global leadership, right? And so the thing is that there's all of this just frame breaking where you try to make this thing, we're going to make the State Department more efficient. And you start thinking harder and harder, what is the State Department? Why do we need a State Department, right? And you're just basically, as you get more and more galaxy brained, you're basically just like, actually, the reality is the United States does not have an executive branch. It has an administrative branch. And therefore, the path to genuine monarchy is very clear. You have a presidential candidate who, for the first time in our lifetimes, tells the American people the truth. He comes out and he's like, hey, fellow Americans, I know y'all had 11th grade civics, how a bill becomes a law, checks and balances, all that great stuff, great class, I remember Mrs. Fox super well. Gosh, she was hot, and in any case, and I really like that class. On the other hand, we have to recognize that political forms often vary greatly from the realities under this. If you're interested in this, I encourage you to read the very interesting book by Mr. James Burnham from 1940 called The Machiavellians. But if you're not interested in this and you want it simple, it's all a bunch of bullshit, and it always has been. And in specific, actually, when you elect me under normal circumstances, you should be aware that you're basically electing Elizabeth II. You're electing a symbol. But this time we're going to do it for real. This time we're going to have a real election. And if you elect me as the chief executive of the executive branch, I will actually act as the chief executive of the executive branch. And the first thing that I need to do, since there is no executive branch, and since there is this entirely factitious administrative branch whose personnel, budget, and policy are in fact set by the permanent oligarchy in the Congress, which was intended to be the laboratory of democracy and has wound up becoming, with its 99% incumbency rate and bizarre seniority system, our nation's preeminent buffer against democracy. I am going to use my executive power to build a new executive branch whose first task will be to shut down in an orderly way, preserving all government services, the old administrative branch. Furthermore, as I read the Constitution, one of the absolute genius things in the Constitution is the fact that it does not specify the precedence of the branches. This is evidence of the founders' absolute genius, because they knew they were actually explaining what we in political science class call the Schmittian exception. And they were understanding that at the top level, power cannot be specified, and it will need to change hands depending on what the nation needs. So, for example, in the Marbury versus Madison decision, the Supreme Court basically seized supremacy over the other branches and basically declared that it was no longer a co-equal branch, it was a supreme branch. And that was then, this is now. And so that needs to rotate a little bit. And the only way to get out of this, which is the only way to have an executive branch, is to accept that this new executive branch is going to treat these usurping branches, which had actually completely smothered the executive power and thus smothered democracy, and treated them as supreme branches, and the worm simply has to turn. And therefore, I, in my role as president for the next 4 years, will be treating the role of the Congress and the Supreme Court, except the impeachment power, which I will respect, as purely advisory.
So what you would have to have then, and because it's very interesting because you bring up ideas of traditional kingship there, and then you talk about the much more modern Schmittian state of exception. And he says sovereign is he who decides the state of exception. I think
sovereign is he who decides who prevails in the conflict between the president and the Supreme Court.
Yes, indeed. And so you would have to have a president who understood that the law does not give you all of the answers, and that sooner or later you need a sort of sovereign decisionism to kick in. The one question,
you might even say that the Constitution is not a suicide pact. In fact, can I take a moment to make a speech? It's not my speech, but it's not my speech, but it's highly relevant to what we've been discussing.
Yes.
All right, this will take a few minutes. Do we have time for this?
Yeah, I mean, if you have the time, then we have the time.
I do have the time. I do have the time. All right, so this is a historical speech. It's from the year of our Lord, 1933.
It's already quite ominous.
And so, without further ado, let's go. If I read the temper of our people correctly, we now realize, as we have never realized before, our interdependence on each other. That we cannot merely take, but we must give as well. That if we are to go forward, we must move as a trained and loyal army, willing to sacrifice for the good of a common discipline. Because without such discipline, no progress is made, no leadership becomes effective. We are, I know, ready and willing to submit our lives and property to such discipline, because it makes possible a leadership which aims at a larger good. This I propose to offer, pledging that the larger purposes will bind upon us all as a sacred obligation with a unity of duty hitherto evoked only in time of armed strife. With this pledge taken, I assume unhesitatingly the leadership of this great army of our people, dedicated to a disciplined attack upon our common problems. Action in this image and to this end is feasible under the form of government which we have inherited from our ancestors. Our Constitution is so simple and practical that it is possible always to meet extraordinary needs by changes in emphasis and arrangement without loss of essential form. That is why our constitutional system has proved itself the most superbly enduring political mechanism the modern world has produced. It is to be hoped that the normal balance of executive and legislative authority may be wholly adequate to meet the unprecedented task before us. But it may be that an unprecedented demand and need for undelayed action may call for temporary departure from that normal balance of public procedure. I am prepared, under my constitutional duty, to recommend the measures that a stricken nation in the midst of a stricken world may require. These measures, or such other measures as the Congress may build out of its experience and wisdom, I shall seek, within my constitutional authority, to bring to speedy adoption. But in the event that the Congress shall fail to take one of these two courses, and in the event that the national emergency is still critical, I shall not evade the clear course of duty that will then confront me. I shall ask the Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis, broad executive power, to wage a war against the emergency as great as the power that would be given to me were we in fact invaded by a foreign foe. For the trust reposed in me, I will return the courage and the devotion that befit the time. I can do no less. We face the arduous days that lie before us in the warm courage of the national unity, with a clear consciousness of seeking old and precious moral values, with a clean satisfaction that comes from the stern performance of duty by old and young alike. We aim at the assurance of a rounded and permanent national life. We do not distrust the future of essential democracy. The people of the United States have not failed. In their need, they have registered a mandate that they want direct, vigorous action. They have asked for discipline and direction under leadership. They have made me the present instrument of their wishes. In the spirit of the gift, I take it. In this dedication of a nation, we humbly ask the blessing of God. May he protect each and every one of us. May he guide me in the days to come. That is the last 10 paragraphs of FDR's first inaugural address in 1933. A very tumultuous year. You might have thought it would be someone else.
At the beginning, I thought it was a certain Austrian painter. but
Sometimes
in my worst
I've done this
giveaways,
speech, and I instead of saying Constitution and Congress,
Yes.
I say like Reichstag, and then
but also it contains the word emergency, and Schmidt's own word for the state of exception is sort of it's Ausnahmezustand is the German, and it's the state of exception. So in other words, you can't always resort to the documents in order to understand your present situation.
Sure.
It requires acts of human will. But this is going to be my final question.
Excellent.
Curtis, if I may. So it's funny because you have these sorts of modern neo-monarchs, and you would probably class FDR as one, and then we have the more traditional monarchs. You talk about Elizabeth I there, and Elizabeth I's views of monarchy were fairly similar to James I, and James I actually wrote a book about it called the Law. If I may, it's called the True Law of Free Monarchy. Monarchies is the name of his book, and in it he has this very clear idea, being the man of his time, that the monarch isn't just this sort of sovereign will, this sort of godlike figure. FDR speaks about himself as a godlike figure, that he is himself responsible before God. And so as James writes in that book, Jove's thunderclaps lighten oftener on the great and mighty oaks than they do on the low and supple willow trees. There's this idea that the monarch is, yes, in a position of immense power and privilege, but also in possession of immense responsibility, and is raised with a sense of duty. To what extent are your neo-monarchs, people like FDR, given their modernity, their modernism, are they not going to be more, if I may, are they not going to be more intoxicated by a sense of their own merit and likely to act more dangerously on account of that?
Well, that was a very 20th century thing. And when we look at World War II recently in the news, trending World War II, right?
Yes.
When you look at World War II, I think we're struck by the fact that really, I think all four of the contending monarchs in this, Hitler, Stalin, FDR, and Churchill, but certainly Hitler, Stalin, and FDR are all basically atheists. And Stalin very explicitly, Hitler and FDR, I think someone once said that, someone close to him once said that, FDR didn't believe in God, he believed in FDR. And
exactly what I'm saying. It's the risk.
Yeah, that's the risk. And so there's sort of two answers to the question. One is that, God is not actually dead, and if you choose an atheist king, you kind of deserve what you get. The second answer is that it is actually possible to build. So in the private sector, which is exclusively monarchical because it has to actually get things done, what we have instead of God is we have a board. And, I recently worked with the board of a company to fire the CEO. Of course, at the sovereign level, this causes all sorts of problems, which is, what if the CEO king just arrests the board? You have to solve that, something blockchain. And did I mention the blockchain? And there's a third answer that goes back to history, which I think is illustrative about the difference between the sort of the course of history from the Tudors to the Stuarts. Because when you read James's protestations about the importance of divine right monarchy, I find it interesting because actually I believe Elizabeth had more actual power than James, and I believe Henry VIII had more actual power than Elizabeth, and I believe Henry VII had more actual power than any of them.
Certainly.
And you did not mess with Henry VII. He won his kingdom with a sword. Right, and so the thing is,
John Fortescue's pamphlets counted for little in that environment.
Indeed, and this idea that nobody in the Tudor world, as far as I can tell, gave a crap about Magna Carta. They probably had not even heard of it. They had a parliament, and
it's not in Shakespeare's play about King John. It's not even mentioned.
Yeah, and they had a parliament, and their parliament seems to have had roughly the power of the Chinese National People's Congress, and it was something of a rubber stamp, parliament, I believe, and it was just a medieval, it was like a sort of traditional thing that had to be done, but it did not, I think Elizabeth was starting to have issues with Parliament later in her reign. I don't recall it being an issue for Henry VIII. Again, I'm not David Starkey, so I'm not an expert on the period. I'll have to, and so James the First comes in. First of all, I believe Elizabeth the First is a little bit weaker simply because she's a woman. And so she's already kind of delegating a little much to Walsingham and the Cecils. You already see this like civil service state kind of starting to form. They do this scurvy trick of executing Mary Queen of Scots and then telling her about it, which she's just like, what the fuck? But she's not like, what the fuck, off with your heads. She's just like, really? Did you have to do that? And then, Mary's son, takes over, and James the First, or as he's sometimes known, James VI, takes over, and he's a Scotsman. He speaks in some kind of unintelligible brogue, and he has no domestic power base. And so he's insisting on the divine right of kings. He's like insisting on the theory because he doesn't really have the practice. Whereas it never really occurred to Henry VIII to insist on the divine right of kings because he had no idea he had to insist on it, right? And he just actually had that power. And then you start to see Charles I start to make these concessions to new liberal ideas of monarchy, and it's about as fatal as the concessions of, Louis XVI to like constitutional monarchy. And so, the idea that the revolution was first in the mind of the king, and I think is still in the mind of the king. And let me pose one question. Can I pose a question to you?
I'll do my best.
As an American, let's suppose that in an alternate reality, let's suppose we could do some kind of a brain transplant on Charles III, or maybe, since he appears to be aging rapidly, William, and, Charles. He has cancer. Does Charles III have cancer? He has cancer of some kind, right?
I think he might have some medical troubles, but in any case, he's an old man. So.
He's an old man. All right. So William takes the throne, and he's just like, wow, I could clean up this whole country. And technically, on paper, I have the power to clean up this whole country, so I'm going to do it. And the question is, could he? What would happen if he actually tried that? What would happen if he basically takes the throne and he's like, I'm your new king, we're going to have martial law, I'm in command of the police, and we're going to clean everything up? What would happen?
I think that he would have some success. Well, I don't think he personally would have success, but I think if he was inclined to do it, and if he marketed it in
he knew what he was doing,
if he marketed it in an appropriately democratic way, it might win more support than we'd expect.
I think that actually the support of the democratic public is a cipher. I think that actually all you need is command of the police. I think that, especially these really regrettable anti-Cambrian, riots. These are not demonstrations. These are not protests. These are riots. Let's call them what they are. I'm outraged that I can't imagine the level of fear I would have as a person of Welsh, in this country today, having seen those riots. And I mean, the English flag is a direct threat to the Welsh. Like, why would you not be waving the Union Jack, right? It's only one reason you want to destroy Wales, right? And deport the Welsh to Rwanda or something horrible like that, right? And can you imagine the horror, women and children screaming in Welsh, as they're loaded onto these planes to Kigali, and it's a horrific thought. And so I don't think that actually the opinions of the people matter at all. I think it's just a question of whether you'd actually gain control over the security forces, and I think it would actually be relatively easy. And so perhaps the revolution, as well as being first in the mind of the king, is last in the mind of the king. The question of whether an American president could do the same thing is also very interesting. Okay, you take office, you're like, I'm the chief executive of the executive branch, I'm going to do an American Gorbachev doctrine, dissolve the global American empire by dissolving the State Department. No more State Department, no more international community, it was all a bunch of bullshit. It's done, and we're just going to treat Airstrip 1 as entirely independent. And by the way, if you want your colonies back, up to you. you know, and up to you, right? What effect do you think that would have on English politics? Right, you want to have a king back? Up to you. You want to go Nazi? You want to go communist? You want to go anarchist? You want an Antifa republic? Up to you. Up to you. You're a sovereign and independent country. So the U.S., president, abolishes the State Department, and he's like, literally, we are closing all the embassies. We are closing the Truman Building. We are basically, my system administrators are shutting down the servers right now. If you work from out of the office at the State Department and you come to work tomorrow, the doors will be closed. They will be locked. If you work from home, your login will no longer work. All of the files have been seized. We're taking the building down on Tuesday with no one in it. All those beautiful, the row of flags in the Truman Building, we'll probably pull the flags before taking the building down. It's a nice building, but not that great. And it'll all be gone. And, on the other hand, who's up against this plan? 50,000 State Department FSOs. What if they form a militia? What if these State Department officers fight in the street? Many of them have weapons training. They have, pepper spray. They could fight with pepper spray, or they could, here's what they could do. They could use their alliance with people of color to form a real army. There would be rioting in the streets of Anacostia and Baltimore as the indigenous people of color rise up to defend the State Department and U.S. foreign policy. Right. And you're just like, actually, when you stop LARPing, you realize that sort of all of these forces that would supposedly prevent this from happening have no power whatsoever. And historically, one of the things, the Democrats understand this much better than the Republicans, and they've been busy wargaming out exactly these scenarios. There's a wonderful article by Barton Gellman about it, and they're just like, we would lose. And in 2016, they realized this very clearly. They're just like, nothing can stop this guy. And then they realized that actually Trump had no intention of crossing the Rubicon. He was actually just, in the phrase of Ernst von Salomon, fishing in the Rubicon. and this sort of fishing in the Rubicon is like a LARPy marketing thing, has become kind of the state of the art in like marketing American political bullshit, and will probably spread around the world as American political bullshit does, but it's still actually bullshit. It's like, sort of a fake thing. And it reminds me, and let me close with this, like in terms of like politics and regime change, is that when you have a real regime change in a country, everyone's life changes. Follow the German Democratic Republic. You're in, East Berlin in 1985, 1995. Your life is completely different, almost no matter what you do. Okay, that's what a real regime change looks like. Electing Donald Trump in 2016, that is not what a real regime change looks like. And it reminds me, when thinking about this, it sort of reminds me, and this is an odd sort of, very lib analogy because this writer is very, very much a lib. Do you know the books of Ursula K. Le Guin, The Wizard of Earthsea? Classic fantasy, really good fantasy novel, despite having been written by a total shit lib. Do you use that term here?
Yes.
And she has a sort of magical universe with like Wizard School and all of this other Harry Potter stuff. But there's a sort of interesting twist, which is that, the spell of like changing you into a frog of like, is one of the easiest spells you learn in Wizard School. Like, I can change you into a frog, but it's just an illusion. You're still you. You look like a frog. It's like false change. But, it's one of the easiest spells to learn. I'll turn myself into a frog. I'll be not a frog. But actually the most difficult spell to learn is the one that actually changes you into a frog. And like, this, you already have this dichotomy of like LARPy suggestions of regime change. And like to take this language and say, no, but this time we're actually doing it, is something, it's something that sort of wouldn't work in the traditional, very like, someone was criticizing my ideas in like the New Republic or something. Americans are a pragmatic people. We're the people that invented the word pragmatism. I'm like, wow, yeah, that was definitely true of the Americans of like 1896. But actually the Americans of 2024 are incredibly frivolous, incredibly ironic. It is the most ironic society in history. I believe, irony has always been the domain of the few and the aristocratic, and it is now utterly mass market. And so, ideas like, imagine people trying to cope with a film like The Matrix or Inception in like 1960. They'd just be like, what? Right. And, people watching Inception, 10 years ago when it comes out are just like, oh, yeah, there's 3 levels of reality and that one is totally fake and we'll fall into this one. So actually, like, total frame breaking of this kind in some ways is actually easier than the sort of incremental political logic that people have employed in the past. They can sort of more easily imagine, oh man, it's all the Truman Show. In fact, they mostly already believe that it's all the Truman Show. They just don't understand the implications of that.
Curtis Yarvin, potential prophet of a future age of kings, thank you very much indeed for joining me on The Porch.
Thank you so much, Harrison.